Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I'm going to unpack some scholarship. In particular, I'm going to unpack the paper from SIGSE, assuming it wasn't canceled, which is titled Scratch Encore, the Design and Pilot of a Culturally Relevant Intermediate Scratch Curriculum. This paper was written by Diana Franklin, David Weintraub, Jennifer Palmer, Marieke Conrad, Melissa Kobian, Kristen Beck, Andrew Rasmussen, Sue Kraus, Max White, Marco Anaya, and Zachary Crenshaw. And apologies, I probably mispronounced at least two of those names. Just like the last Unpacking Scholarship episode, this paper is available if you're an ACM member, and the direct link to the paper can be found in the show notes, which you can find in the description below, or by visiting jaredoleary.com. And as always, if there is a Google Scholar profile associated with a particular author on the paper, if you click on the last name for the author, it'll take you directly to that, so you can read more papers by these authors. Let's get started with the abstract. Quote, "While several introductory computer science curricula exist for children in K through 8, there are few options that go beyond sequence, loops, and basic conditionals. The goal of this project is to not only fill this gap with a high-quality curriculum supported by complete instructional materials, but to also do so with an equity-balanced curriculum. That is, a curriculum that values advancing equity equally with student learning outcomes. In this paper, we introduce barriers to equity in public school classrooms, pedagogical approaches to culturally relevant curricula, and how our Scratch Encore curriculum is designed to support equity-balanced learning. Finally, we present results of our pilot year, including early evidence of students taking advantage of the culturally relevant design aspects." End quote. If I were to provide a one-sentence summary of this particular paper, I would say that this paper introduces the Scratch Encore curriculum and provides a quick summary of positive feedback from the teachers who use the curriculum during a pilot year. So the authors begin this paper by highlighting large-scale CS initiatives that have tried to meet the need and desire for CS education in public schools. So for example, in 2017, Chicago Public Schools has introduced computer science to over 150 schools in their district. In addition, the authors also mentioned that funding opportunities for research on and implementation of CS in high school contexts have been around for the past several years. So in other words, there's a lot of support going on with CS education, particularly in the elementary range, and then a lot of support in the high school range. But the authors suggest there is a gap between platforms and curricula for early learning and the content in high school context. So the goal of the Scratch Encore curriculum is to fill that need in terms of providing an intermediate Scratch curriculum. Now, while I will agree that there was a gap in curricula at the time of 2017, I would argue that the curriculum that I have created for Boot Up, which is also free, and the curriculum that Google has created with CS First, which is also free, both fill this gap as well. So if you're interested in seeing not only the Scratch Encore curriculum, but also those other two curricula that I just provided, all three of which are free, then you can check those out by visiting the show notes. So this particular paper explores two questions. Quote, 1, how do teachers perceive it? And 2, is Scratch Encore succeeding in providing opportunities for creativity and cultural expression while also introducing computing concepts in a structured way? And if so, how is the curriculum enabling it? End quote. That's on page 794. In the review of literature, the authors summarize scholarship relevant to K-8 educators on programming environments, such as block-based platforms and pedagogies such as constructionism. Next, the authors unpack culturally relevant CS curricula, which is curricula that aligns, quote, content with the culture, prior experience, and social values and norms of the learner, which can improve retention, engagement, and learning outcomes, end quote. So that's a modified quote from page 795. It's modified because I simply added the word which to make it more sense with what I was just talking about. So in this section, the authors suggest there are 4 dimensions of culturally relevant curricula. The first one is explanations of concepts are drawn from, quote, students' current understandings and experiences, end quote. It's on page 795. So in other words, the design of the curriculum itself needs to account for what students currently know and things that they are currently experiencing. So the second thing that they recommend is that it should draw on cultural heritage. Now, a thing that I'd like some clarification on is what does cultural heritage mean? Because culture and heritage in particular can mean many different things. But I know this is a short paper, so they'll probably unpack it at the conference itself, assuming it's not canceled. Because again, I'm recording this in advance of SIGSE. The third thing that they recommend as a dimension is that the curriculum can draw on practices, media, and other elements from youth culture. So an example of a practice might be texting, an example of media might be video games and things like that. And the last thing that they suggest as a dimension for culturally relevant curricula is that the ability for students to customize projects around their own selves. is an important aspect. This is something that really resonates with me. I strongly agree with this, that this is something that we need to take into account for any kind of learning experience, especially if we can't assume buy-in. In other words, if all kids are mandated to take computer science as opposed to kids are electing to take computer science, we can assume some buy-in in that instance. Now, the review of literature concludes with a discussion on barriers to equity, so with a particular focus on a lack of resources and access for intermediate CS instruction. So if you want to read the article itself, you can find some of those resources in there that address that area. Okay, so what is the Scratch Encore design? So it includes, at the time of writing, 15 learning modules for kids who have over a year of experience with coding and uses the approach of use, modify, create. In other words, to kind of summarize that approach is you engage with some kind of a platform, then you learn to kind of like tinker with the code behind that platform, like maybe changing some of the variables or parameters or things like that, maybe altering the code a little bit. And then the create part is you'll actually learn how to synthesize and apply your understandings into some kind of a new project. In future episodes of Unpacking Scholarship, I'll kind of describe the use, modify, create approach more than I just did. Okay, so the curriculum itself is broken up into 3 separate strands. So and these strands include multicultural, youth culture, and gaming. So here's a quote that describes them. Quote, "The multicultural strand draws on celebrations, events, or traditions, including many that are used or celebrated by cultures often not highlighted in dominant American culture. These include the Million Woman March, Dia de los Muertos, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech. The second strand, youth culture, includes themes that resonate with many youth today, including sports and social networks. The third strand is the gaming strand, which was teachers' top subject that they identified their students as wanting to learn with computing." End quote. That's from page 796. One of the things that I appreciate is that, quote, "students are able to personalize projects and put something of themselves into them. A first level includes providing sprites at multiple skin tones and varying gender representations. Deeper levels include asking students to customize MLK Jr.'s speech to their own wishes for equality and putting memories of their own family members in the ofrenda in Dia de los Muertos." End quote. It's on page 797. So again, I really do value any kind of curricula like the Scratch Encore or the one that I created for Boot Up or Google CS First that allows you to customize things and allows kids to kind of tinker with things to make it their own and to make it so that their own interests shine and are evident within the expressions that they create. Okay, so let's talk about the study itself. So the study itself was with 8 teachers who taught grades 5 through 7 who attended professional development. In total, they had 279 students who participated across those 8 teachers. And data was collected through worksheets, observations, interviews, focus groups, and other computational artifacts, such as like a Scratch project. Okay, so in the findings, overall, the teacher feedback was very positive. And in particular, the teachers really liked the worksheets and overall process. Now, the authors don't actually mention any criticisms from the teachers, which for me is just always something that is more of a red flag than anything. The reason why I say that is because there's always something that can be better. There's always something that can be improved. And it's either an omission from the authors who wrote this, or it's just an omission from the teachers in that they just didn't want to voice a concern or a complaint. And that's not meant as a criticism on the authors who wrote this by any means. Now, the only real criticism that is provided is they say that, quote, "teachers noted that the lessons took more time than anticipated," end quote. That's on page 799. So following the quick summary of teacher feedback, they provide a couple of quick case studies that kind of highlight what occurred. So after reading this, I have some lingering questions or thoughts. So one of them is, who gets to determine what kids consider as part of their culture or identities? So for example, just because a kid is raised within a set of cultures does not mean they actually identify with those cultures or have any interest in them. A common example that I could easily point to is that many people grow up in a religious culture that they don't identify with or even have any interest in. I can think of many people that I know who grew up culturally as X religion, but now I don't identify with that religion. Also, in what ways might educators and curriculum developers unintentionally essentialize students by assuming identification with a culture? So in CS education, culture is often conflated with identities on gender or sex or race or socioeconomic status or geographic location or whatever. So there are many different ways that people can kind of label something as a particular culture. And what I wonder is, if we go into something, are we making assumptions about people and which cultures they identify with, or which demographics that they strongly identify with? And if so, are we then essentializing them into those particular cultures? So an example from where I live in Phoenix, Arizona. So there's a large Latinx or Hispanic population here. And some of the assumptions that people make about the students in Arizona because of the large Hispanic population is that, oh, they must really like mariachi music. And the reason why people make that assumption is because of the cultural backgrounds of many of the students that are in Arizona. However, that is often a gross essentialization of students of Hispanic or Latinx heritage. In particular, I can attest that most of the students did not listen to mariachi music unless they were forced to, and most of them honestly preferred rap over anything else, at least with the classes that I work with across multiple districts in different parts of the valley. So again, to highlight this, if a curriculum developer were to come into Phoenix, Arizona, and as an outsider be like, oh, well, Hispanic culture and this heritage, they're going to really like this lesson that incorporates creating mariachi music with computer science or coding. Maybe not. Some of them might, but honestly, most of them probably won't. At least based on my experiences and the many teachers I've spoken with in Arizona. So another question that I have that's related to this is, where is the line between culturally relevant curricula and culturally specific curricula? So when engaging in discussions with other curriculum developers or curriculum specialists at districts, there's often this conflation of culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally relevant curricula with a culture itself by saying, oh, you need to make a curriculum that targets X population or Y population. While I understand that there are best intentions with this kind of approach, I would suggest that, again, making something culturally specific can become problematic when you are essentializing and making assumptions based off of demographic information. So my previous example kind of highlights that. However, I want to kind of contextualize this a bit more. I have sat in a meeting with somebody who was well-intentioned, who was trying to talk about culturally responsive curricula, and who suggested, in order to make a curriculum more culturally relevant to Hispanic kids, you need to include more tacos and mariachi music. And quite frankly, I found that offensive. Making something that is culturally specific can essentialize and make assumptions about people. Not saying that the Scratch Encore does that, because quite frankly, I have not spent enough time looking at the actual curriculum itself outside of reading this paper and looking at some of the projects that they have on their website. But it was just something that came to mind when I was reading this particular paper. So another question that I have is, how might CS educators and curriculum developers prevent efforts in culturally relevant experiences from coming across as pandering to youth culture? So this question comes out of my experiences with seeing adults who are not gamers try and relate to kids by talking about video games. And quite frankly, I find those interactions to be quite hilarious as somebody who games regularly for multiple hours a day. We need to make sure that when we're creating these resources for kids, that we are in fact engaging with kids in a holistic manner and not some kind of contrived or artificial manner that ends up doing more harm than good, or makes kids just kind of like giggle on the side like, wow, this adult clearly does not understand my life and what I'm interested in. Now, one of the things that actually stood out that's kind of like a lingering thing that I've been thinking through is the section that is on the teacher feedback. There's a teacher quote that mentioned, quote, "I also like having my students do an old school worksheet because it helps them to think about what they just learned, and I can use them as exit tickets or mini assessments," end quote. That's on page 798. So the reason why this is highlighted in here is because the Scratch Encore curriculum includes worksheets. Now, I question if this is focusing on what teachers are more used to or comfortable with, rather than focusing on whether kids actually enjoy learning through this approach or if they consider it as busy work. In general, I have not really found a worksheet that I have been super thrilled with or thought was an engaging experience for kids that they walked away with wanting to do more of. But perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps Scratch Encore has some awesome worksheets that kids actually do enjoy engaging with and do want to learn more, and does increase their interest in computer science. I just honestly don't know. And my final question is, what didn't teachers like about the curriculum? Yes, they mentioned that some of these sections took longer than anticipated. However, I'm really curious what the critical feedback is, and if there wasn't any, why? And the reason why I asked is because, I've created curriculum that has been used literally around the world, everywhere except the continent of Antarctica. If you know anyone there, let me know. I'd love to say every continent. And while the vast majority of teachers really love the resources, it's still not perfect. There's still things that we could do or could be different for the different use cases or things like that. And I know that because I've received critical feedback, in addition to all the positive things that I've received. So my question is just basically, what didn't the teachers like about it? And how could I, as a curriculum developer, kind of learn from that negative or critical feedback? All right, so that's kind of a summary of the paper itself. Again, you can find a link to Scratch Encore where you can register and receive access to it for free, as well as links to the other intermediate free Scratch curriculum that I mentioned that I've created for boot up, and as well as Google created with CS First. All of those are in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. And I hope you tune in next week, which will be an interview.